Good afternoon, and welcome to D&I One-on-One, a bi-weekly webinar series where we talk about different topics related to culture, inclusivity, diversity, and belongingness. In today's conversation, owning your own voice. So my name is Jina Etienne. I am the creator and host of this series. I'm a certified diversity executive centered on something I call fearless inclusion, which I define as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. And I develop trainings and workshops for organizations to help create spaces of true belonging, and for people for my participants to connect mindfulness and self-awareness to their daily actions and words. And the goal in creating this series was to raise awareness and for participants to leave with a greater understanding of the individual and collective intentions and how they all align, and how we can, and to raise awareness around the rich depth and breadth and complexity of leading, managing, and navigating diverse organizations. Joining me today is Jess Nava. She's Chief Growth Officer at the Moxie Exchange and home of the Everyday Inclusion app, which something tells me she's going to mention here today. Jess and I are both members of the Society for Diversity, and we first connected through their LinkedIn group. And I love her energy and her passion for this work, and I knew right away her perspective and experience was perfect for this series. When Jess isn't focused on being a DEI change maker, she's busy writing a book, kudos, hanging out with her 3 teenage kids, God bless you, watching and coaching and playing volleyball. Welcome, Jess. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Janae. I'm so excited about our conversation. Thank you.
Speaking of our conversation, I want to start by going back to that first call that we had. And we were talking about this topic, and you referred to yourself as the middle-aged white woman in the context of who's invited to be in the DEI conversation. So can you talk a little bit more about that and share how that frames today's conversation?
Yeah, so first and foremost, thank you to the Society, to all those calling in. I hope to make this a fun, exciting, and educational conversation, right? I really do want you to engage with questions. The reality is, Janae, we need everyone's voices at the table. And for so long, I was so hesitant as a woman in tech speaking up. And so what I've realized in the last 10 years really of my journey of finding my confidence, of finding my voice, is that traditionally marginalized individuals can also tend to feel this way, right? Scared to speak up, scared to, right, not being the majority, right? When you are the only in the room, it's unnerving. And so it's really our job as the majority, when you are in a majority position, when you have the privilege in the room, no matter what that privilege is, that could be age, seniority, expertise, race, gender, it's our job to lend that privilege to someone else to help elevate other people's voices.
So that gets me to, let's see, I'm going to jump us to this polling question. Can we go ahead and open with that, Christine?
Absolutely. We have just launched poll question number 1, everyone. So if you don't see it on your screens, please let me know. Otherwise, we're going to keep this open for about 60 seconds.
You know, Jess, you just jumped right into it when you were talking about lending somebody their privilege. So I thought, sure, let's go there. And, you know, when the poll closes, I'm curious to see what others feel. But can you kick this off by talking a little bit about, let me call it, I don't want to call it like the privilege grenade, but and then I just use those terms. What I mean by that, though, is it's become a sticky word. It's become a word that can divide and not bring us together. So hopefully, I'm seeing here most of the people so far, Jess, I don't know if you can see the results, are saying they're not familiar with this term. So I would love to be able to, can you start with that, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, so you want me to dig into the waterline of invisibility?
No, let's talk about lending privilege and the fact that privilege itself can be in some cases, it almost can be divisive. Some people are don't really understand it. Can you talk about that some more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, unfortunately, terms in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space have been either politicized or there are soapboxes that are used. And so privilege is one of those terms. I think, right, when we hear of privilege, we think of white privilege. And so in the work that I do, I meet with a lot of middle or older white men. And specifically, this can literally cause a visceral reaction. That, well, Jess, you don't know anything about me, right? So don't assume just because I'm a middle-aged white man that I have privilege. And that is actually the reality. We all have certain kinds of privilege depending on the room that we're in or the people that we're around. So I thought it was really important just to ground on the actual definition of privilege, right? It can be subtle. It can be something that you're not aware of, something in someone's background. It really is just, it's an upper hand, right? It's an advantage. Write this as an immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. And so I think we just as human beings, we make a lot of assumptions and we assume that someone has a privilege that they may not have. So I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. And I see here when, I don't know if you saw the results, but 3% said they were familiar with it. Oh,
Wow.
yay, you're sharing the results. 5% somewhat,
Cool. Okay.
6% vaguely, 82% no. And so I think maybe you can tell us now what it means, lending your privilege.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you want to jump to the waterline of invisibility slide that we had thrown in
Absolutely.
here.
Here we go.
Amazing. So when we think about diversity or we think about representation, it's really easy for this kind of above the water, right, the iceberg, to think about someone's skin color, their gender. Age is a tricky one.
Well, Jess, you see someone, and we all put an age on them. What we've
Absolutely.
learned is you don't tell people the age that you think they are.
That's
Don't
right.
do that.
Right, nationality, physical abilities, all of these things that we can see around someone's physical existence. And so we make these assumptions. When the beauty of humanity is all of the pieces that make us who we are. And so as we dig below that iceberg, we start to learn more about people. And so this is where curiosity really becomes key to learning more about someone's background and who they are and what they bring to the table. I'll give you a great example. I was having a conversation with an executive this week who has a son who is on the spectrum. He has autism. And he was speaking to a peer whose child has Down syndrome. And he said to him, he's like, I'm lucky because people see my son and they know that he has Down syndrome, right? It's a physical rendering of a disability. He's like, when folks see your son, they think he has bad parents, right? Because he misbehaves in society, right? His rendering of the disease, the disability. And so, right, we need to learn and grow and think about what is deeper within people. And so in a situation where maybe you've got a room of, let's say, middle-aged white men, you think, well, they all have privilege. Not necessarily, right? That CEO or that C-suite executive has a power or position privilege versus a new employee who, right, may be an individual contributor. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you're good.
It's like the lag, right?
Oh.
So a couple things come to mind. One, the way you were just referring to privilege, some of that is contextual.
Yeah.
Because frankly, all those white men in that room do have privilege in the traditional sense that we talk about privilege. And by that, I only mean that there are barriers that they never faced. And as a result, they fall into this invisible space. The old term we used to use is blind spot, but we don't use that term anymore because it's just, some people don't like the term, but ableist. It's just, blind spot's a real thing, so we didn't want to throw it out there inappropriately. But I think that's where privilege lands. And so that was just one thought. And then the other thought I had was part of that initial conversation I mentioned in the opening, in your intro. I see you said middle-aged white woman, and I remember in the conversation, I'm like, yeah, okay, I see that. And then you talked a little bit more about all of those things that are invisible.
Right.
Are you cool with sharing that? Or otherwise I can share some of mine.
Oh, I'm ready to go.
Yeah,
Janae, it's the reason that I'm in this space now. It's the reason that my career is leading sales and partnerships for a tech company that focuses on DEI. So I'm married to a Filipino man. My children are biracial. They're half Filipino, half Caucasian. And then I have a child who has some mental health and is also on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And so you would never know that. And honestly, when I got into DEI work, I was leading an employee resource group for the tech company that I was previously at, our women's employee resource group. And so I was fighting for women's rights. I was fighting for representation. At that point in the organization's growth, we had less than 23% of executives that were women.
in
And
the
so,
organization that you were working with at the time.
exactly. Yep. And so really getting super active in this women's ERG. And then we got to a point where we were going to launch Mosaic. It was our employee resource group for employees of color. And I remember sitting back and like, I have this light bulb moment. And I'm like, Jess, why aren't you doing this for your kids? Why aren't you doing this to be a better ally for your husband? And so that's where I really started to educate myself in the DEIB space, which led me to the Moxie Exchange where I am now, and really leaning it heavily into inclusion and belonging. Right, because I think it's really important that we delineate early in this conversation. Diversity, equity, those are systems, processes. Inclusion and belonging is where, right, there are these actions all day, every single day, and that's how people feel like they're included. So that's what I focus on, is more inclusion and belonging through the tech that we work with.
Yeah, we're both there. I think helping people understand that difference that you just mentioned with diversity and equity, that's actually, I think, the first place people go to when they think about D&I.
Yeah.
And then in fact, the belonging piece is the result of the work.
That's right.
And I remember recently I was doing a training with a client, and I asked everyone in the room, instead of thinking about what inclusion is from a perspective of the things we are doing to help other people feel inclusive, because that's important to understand, I asked them to flip it. And in fact, I'm going to encourage our participants to think about this. And if you want, throw your responses in the Q&A. Feel like to you, when you're feeling like, how do I say this? Like when you feel included, it's going to be through actions, right? And that's what you work on every day. That's what your app does. It helps remind us all to take those actions. But what do they feel like?
Right.
So the responses that I got were really interesting. And I was telling my husband this at breakfast this morning. Okay, now I'm going to tell you his story.
Okay, I love it.
I'm going to go with the I have permission to tell it approach. He started a new role recently, and he had never gone in. They actually have a lunchroom, and he was going to go into the lunchroom, but he didn't really know anybody. He's at a in the C-suite level, so he didn't know how he would be received going into that space. And one of his colleagues invited him in to sit down at the lunch table and have lunch, and it just took all the pressure and the concern out of it, and got me thinking about those of us who walk into that room and we're that only.
Yeah.
And the fear is, it's not just that I don't want to be rejected, because I want to be included, but what I don't want to be is isolated.
Right.
And it starts there, right? And those little actions are what make all of the difference, to keep so that we don't feel alone, because 40% of people say they feel alone at work.
Right.
So where is this slide? I don't know if we can talk about this. Oh, well, actually, no, I don't want to go there yet.
Okay.
Because you had a couple of other things that you wanted to talk about. Tell me what direction you want to go in this conversation.
Oh, I'm willing to go wherever you want to go.
Well, so you talked about the waterline of visibility, and I think you said the beauty of humanity. Most of the things that are important to all of us are invisible to others,
That's right.
right? And so I think that is the power of this this graphic, because if people look at this and you think about like skin color, you know, all Black people don't have the same skin tone. All white people don't have the same skin tone. That can be distracting. So that's important. You talked about what it means to have privilege, and I just want to reinforce that you were talking about having an advantage in a
That's right.
particular situation or in a group, because there's broader privilege. But then I have privilege as a parent in some spaces.
Mm-hmm.
I have privilege as somebody who's married in some spaces.
Right.
There's different types of privilege. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah. Of
And
course.
then this next slide, can you talk about this one and why you wanted this one in here?
Yeah, so this, again, this is a part of my personal journey. So going back to my story, I've spent 23 years in tech, in sales, in leadership. And a majority of that career, I have been the only woman in the room. And so going back to that being the only, it can be unnerving to speak up, right?
Yes.
There's a ton of fear and hesitation. I'm an extrovert and I love people, but I'm I'm hesitant and scared around my own personal brand, especially when I'm feeling excluded, right? You
Or
talked about
conspicuous,
what it
right?
feels like to be included, but specifically when you feel like you're excluded, you don't speak up. And I can tell you, there have been so many times in my career where I wanted to speak up and I wanted to say something. I had an amazing idea. And then literally 2 minutes later, right, that loudest person in the meeting speaks up, shares the idea, and I'm kicking myself.
Yeah.
Or worse, I share an idea, I'm kind of tentative about it, and then someone reinforces that idea and it's taken as their own idea.
I will go with even worse than that. You say it confidently and nobody hears you. The next person says it and everybody heard them. And we know that this is the dynamic that happens in particular with women who aren't heard as much as men in these meetings and in this context. And so, I mean, this is a brilliant point. I also think there's the personality. Not everybody's an extrovert. And this, just because somebody is being quiet in the room, there is so much richness and value and insight that they can offer, but it means we have to quiet down and give them an opportunity to participate.
And so, Janae, when you were kicking off the intro, we were talking about diversity, equity, inclusion as a leader. And so I think a lot of the folks that are calling in are in leadership positions or positions of power. And so I challenge you to think about ways that you can flip the script on this. Right? I want y'all to leave with tactical things that you can do in the workplace. I had an amazing leader in my last job who he saw this trend in me. and he knew the ideas because he would hear them in one-on-ones. And so he started out with, Jess, if I don't hear this idea from you, I'm going to call you out and have you hear the idea. So he would mentally prepare me for it. And then
that's actually really important because not everybody would be comfortable with that. So I'm so happy to hear that.
Amazing leader. I adore this person. Wonderful, wonderful leader. He would then do an amazing job of, right, like as he got me out of my shell, would make sure that he would call on me, or if he heard an idea, would reinforce, hey, well, Jess had this idea. Instead of reiterating the concept, he would call out the fact that it was my idea. So I think those are two amazing things you can do. If you know you've got someone who's an introvert on your team, do that meeting before the meeting and help that person get those amazing ideas out. And then call on them and help give them the confidence to speak up in a meeting, right? Yeah. So it's not just all about how we show up. That is that waterline of invisibility. Being an introvert, sometimes it takes a while to figure out if someone's an extrovert or an introvert.
Yeah, just because there's a pressure. By the way, Christine, let's go ahead and launch this poll. I know we already answered the question, but I know we have to get the polls activated for CPE. But I appreciate what you just said, Jess, because knowing everybody, we think everybody's an extrovert because we've all been trained to behave that way in the workplace. And for those who aren't extroverts, they go home exhausted. Right. And so that's such a good point. By the way, I want to say something came in the Q&A. Another thing Shauna wrote, or they say your idea isn't a good one, and then someone else says the exact same thing, and it's a great idea. And that I think Shauna, I'm going to go with the assumption that Shauna's a she. I think she said she had that happen so many times. And so I just thank you, Shauna, for sharing that.
I also think that's a great point of seeking feedback. And traditionally, right, women and traditionally marginalized individuals struggle in getting authentic feedback.
Yeah.
This is something that is not talked about a lot. So I think this is another great point to that slide specifically, right? If you've got a woman on your team and you're a man, right,
Sorry,
really start
on this slide. This slide.
Okay, right, push the limits with giving that feedback. So that amazing idea, right, if it didn't come across great, then how can I do it in a way that it does come across well?
There's a really important concept called amplification. And some of what you're talking about is when we amplify the voice of another. So in that situation, something, a strategy, some of our participants, if you haven't tried it, you hear somebody say something, you heard them, but it doesn't seem everybody else heard them, because when it comes up again, it comes up as a new idea. And this is my opportunity to say, actually, Jess, I think you just said something about that earlier. Jess, can you just repeat what you said? And so I'm bringing you back into it with credit. That's a great strategy that people can use. And it works.
It really does.
It works. There's another thing in here. I want to make sure we cover all of these things.
Hey, Jina, before we continue, I think we might need to reshare your presentation if that's okay. I think the polls might have just popped it back out. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
You're back up.
Can I ask a question, Christine, out of curiosity?
Yes.
What happens? Does the screen go blank for the participants when that happens?
I think sometimes the polls, because it takes up the full screen, it might be a technological snafu there. So as long as we kind of reset it, it should be okay.
Got it. Thank you. Good to know. Here's a question that just came in, and I want to, before we go any further, how one can overcome the fear of being excluded in a social setting. We're all born and raised with preconceived opinions on interacting with people. That's a really good point. So it's a different side of what we were just talking about. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I think first and foremost, right, like the emotional intelligence it takes to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so having conversations like this, being transparent, being vulnerable, right? That's the Brene Brown, right? Research and methodology. For the next generation of leaders, it's really important that we talk about these things as a team. So I think as a leader, right, it's our job to step up and say, right, at your point, at your age in my career, right, I was scared of, or I have been in a situation where I am the only. Tell me more about that. Do you have a fear of being excluded? Do you, right? So I think we have to prompt our team to open up and talk about these things. I don't think it's natural, right? There's so much fear of blame and shame, doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing. And I'm going to say this again, for those underrepresented, traditionally marginalized people or the only in the room, you don't want to be vulnerable, right? You want to put on your armor and you want to be, extremely professional, and yet inside you are dying and you got this fear of being excluded. And the reality is everyone else has that fear as well.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but I will come at it from another direction, because as humans, we all want to belong. As humans, isolation is actually not healthy.
Right.
We know that there's higher instance of anxiety and depression, heart disease, shorter lifespans when people are chronically alone. That said, though, so I have up here psychological safety, because that's what you were talking about, that we want that safe space. You've used the word safety a couple times. Everybody, you make it sound like, well, it's fair. Everybody feels that way. But the challenge is when you're the only one in the room,
Mhm.
or the minority, there are fears of speaking up or behaving or acting in a way that will reinforce a stereotype. Or
Absolutely.
that will project a stereotype onto you and draw attention to yourself. And if there's something, not only do I not want to be isolated, I don't want to be marginalized. I don't want to be dismissed. And I certainly don't want people to think I'm less competent, less interested, less committed, because they've now projected something onto me because I'm a Black woman, for example.
Right.
So I do think that it's important to recognize that everybody struggles with this. But I think in the work we do in terms of DEI, it's also important to understand the disproportionate impacts of
Exactly.
these same challenges
Right.
on minorities. And it's not just the only person in the room, because that person is a minority in that context. But it's also for minorities and members of this marginalized community. So I just I wanted to speak to that.
Yeah. Well, and I think we have to think about the way that those groups have overcompensated for it their whole lives.
Yeah.
Right. So thinking about, right, like putting ourselves in their shoes, right? There is an exhaustion in doing that. And
Yeah.
so we as amazing leaders know that, understand that, speak to that, again, be open about it.
And
I love
create space for it, because I think if a leader is vulnerable, you're signaling to others that it's okay to be vulnerable.
Right.
One of the things that I love about this particular infographic and the process that they work through, Center for Creative Leadership, look it up. They've got some great tools and resources. The last one, embrace productive conflict, because one of the things we don't do well is debate, because our feelings can get hurt. Talk about not wanting to be vulnerable. I don't want to put an idea out there if I don't know that I agree with you. And if I'm trying to work it out, I'm not going to talk it through with you if I feel like something I say is going to get thrown back in my face, or it's going to escalate into an argument. And so that's a very real fear, and righteously so. None of us want that. So we're just going to avoid it. I'll just keep my mouth shut.
Right. And especially if there are stereotypes around whatever your representation is.
Yeah. Yeah.
We also have to think about that additional lens.
Yeah. Oh, you're you don't have enough experience at work yet. You won't understand this. You're too young, right? Or the exact opposite. You don't understand the newest technology. So, we got this. And you dismiss somebody based on those stereotypes. And I'm purposely going to stereotypes that aren't race related, because a lot of the conversations around race can be tense and create some tension. But I just want to make sure that we understand that all of these group dynamics that we're talking about, they're one-on-one. There's an opportunity to break through and create these inclusive spaces when we just think about this moment to moment, day by day, because inclusion doesn't happen because the organization decides to be inclusive.
Right.
Well, inclusion happens through action, one-to-one action.
And Janae, what you're talking about in those microaggressions is the ability to have difficult conversations or to be a bystander and take action, right? So if I'm watching the microaggression or if I'm in the midst of the microaggression, to have the language and a process to go through, it just doesn't come naturally to human beings.
Right.
We'll shy away from it.
Right.
And as we bring more folks into the team and as we have more beautiful representation of all walks of life, we need to know how to have those conversations, whether we're about or in the middle of it. And we have to practice it.
Yes.
We can't just assume, okay, great, I went and watched a YouTube video. No, we actually need to role play these things and get really comfortable having those difficult, uncomfortable conversations.
Right. We also need to create that psychological safety. So when an uncomfortable moment happens, when an unfortunate oopsie is said, when somebody says something and it feels offensive, that we have a space where we can sort of bumble our way through that and preserve everyone's dignity.
That's right.
That we can extend some grace, that we can understand that the intentions, I'm gonna assume you had good intent,
Right.
even if that really hurt me or that really offended me. If I can do that, it doesn't matter that you had good intent. If I can just give you the grace and assume that, at least it allows us to stay in this conversation. Now, there's so much more to the conversation around microaggressions. It's just a point. But somebody said in here, and this is going further back, you think being a middle-aged white guy is hard? Try going through life with the same challenges and not being white. And they said here, this is toxic. I didn't know if they were talking about this conversation, but what I hope that person has now heard is that that's absolutely true. The more you layer on different identities that are from marginalized communities, single mother who's indigenous and poor, there are so many stereotypes there that you can take one on one. And so we have to recognize the challenges there. I think the other thing that you're inviting people to think about, though, is it doesn't always mean it's easy for the white woman either. It's a different kind of difficulty. And it's not for me to say, well, my heart is more difficult than your heart. It's about understanding and acknowledging.
Yeah.
There's another level of diversity that's invisible diversity.
Yeah.
Now, before we go anywhere, and in case we don't get there, I really do want you to talk about this because I think this calling in versus calling out is really, I don't know that people talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
And so I want to make sure we cover this during today. Can you talk about this a little bit more?
100%. I think there are a way to have conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging that are, right, they are psychologically safe. They're done with a positive intent. And so actually our CEO coined this phrase, which I think we've got in another slide, NBC, nice but clueless. And the reality is we all have these moments. I'm not intending to say something wrong, but it's going to happen. And so I work in the neuroscience of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging with our app. And the way that we position the solution is to call people into the space and to protect them versus calling them out. And
Yeah.
so it can be really difficult. It can be uncomfortable, but to create a psychologically safe place where people feel like they can learn and grow and correct someone or be corrected, that's what calling in does versus calling out, right? When you have that knee-jerk reaction against someone. And to the earlier points, it takes a ton of practice, right? It takes being thoughtful and intentional. And so I think there's a lot of amazing resources now to help people call into the space versus calling out. So Janae, I don't know if I covered that or if you want to add anything to my points there.
No, I think I mean, I agree with you. And I think the challenge we have in this space is the finger pointing, the assumptions, the pressures that we sometimes create because of the things we say, because of the things we don't say, and asking somebody to voice something that they may or may not feel comfortable voicing. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that we all are on this journey differently. All of these things impact us differently. But what we all share, we come back to this again and again, is we don't want to be ignored. We don't want to be isolated. Don't want to be judged. You know, shame is Brene Brown, you mentioned her earlier. I've heard her say a couple of times that shame is something we're really good at here in this country. I don't know that the context that I heard her talk about is here in this country, in the United States. We're good at it and it's powerful. It will shut people down. And so that is something that is underlying a lot of these dynamics as well in organizations, that I'm afraid of that. And we don't articulate this.
Right.
But the data tells us that that psychology is there. It's just I was going to say it's under the waterline, but I don't mean it in the same way as the iceberg. Let me look in here. There's some questions and I want to make sure we're not missing something.
Great.
It says, I am younger than, this is a comment, I'm younger than a lot of my peers at work. So my fear is not having the same knowledge as others and saying something that sounds dumb. Yeah, that's very real. And that's where we talk about psychological safety. I think it's on here on the slide. One of the types of safety is being able to ask a question, learner safety, and not feel dumb or judged. And I can't just say, oh, no, it's safe to ask a question here. It has to be demonstrated. So either I have to ask the dumb question, not intentionally. I mean, as a leader, I have to be willing to throw out there and ask a question where I don't know the answer and I'm inviting feedback. And it's especially important for me as a leader that if somebody asks a question, I validate that it is okay to ask it in some way, shape, or form so that I demonstrate that safety.
Well, and then imagine, I actually love the point that someone called out earlier in their comment, then add a layer of another, right? If you're a minority, if you have a disability, and you're the youngest person on the team, right? All of these layers, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. They all add this fear, this hesitation, this protection that we put around ourselves. And so as leaders, we should be thinking about all of those layers of the people on our team, because every layer that you add adds more complexity to the situation.
Yes.
For that individual.
Intersectionality is a very real thing. And intersectionality is how, when you look at, I'm thinking, you said mosaic, I think kaleidoscope. When you look at all these little elements that make each of us up, if you go back to even this illustration that you use, the fractures in the shape of the iceberg, it's a good way to think about all of these different elements. And when you start to combine them, it creates a unique identity. It's not that we are trying to call out every possible combination of identities here. What we're talking about is recognizing that this difference is there, valuing it, and understanding and being open to it, as opposed to, you mean to tell me I have to do programs for 15 different identities in my organization? No. What we want to do is create space in every organization where it's okay to show up with those identities.
That's right.
Some of which are invisible, right? Somebody asked a question. Reconcile safe spaces and calling in.
Yeah.
Seems like those two are juxtaposed for the less privileged group.
Mm.
Good question, huh?
Great question.
How about this? While you're thinking about that answer, let's go ahead and open polling question number 3, because you just talked about that. Have you ever felt called out during DEI training? Buy you a minute here to answer that question. So let's go back to these definitions then. Take them one by one. What do you think of, how do you describe a safe space, Jess?
Yeah. So I think the two actually go hand in hand. Right. I think when you do create a psychologically safe space, you are calling people in. When you're calling people in, you're in return creating a psychologically safe space. I think what we have done traditionally is we have leaned on the minority to do education for the majority in our workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And so we put that onus and that pressure on those minority groups. And so I can see why you're asking the question the way that you are, and that's what needs to end, right? As a majority, as a white woman, this is why I'm so passionate about this space, because it's my job to go help other white women fully understand our privilege and what we have. And then how do I lend that privilege to minorities and underrepresented individuals? That is why I am so passionate about this. As a woman in technology, I fully believed in sending the elevator back down. And so my call to action is for us to all become allies, right? And so I hope you're starting to see the power of these definitions, this presentation, because it really is, it's a call to action to become allies.
So I will say, I'll be transparent and say that I can see how somebody might take what you just said the exact opposite way. And so by that I mean, and maybe it was just the words and I'm just hearing it wrong, but when you talk about sending the elevator back down, it almost can feel patronizing for people if down are people who are not as fill in the blank.
Sure.
And then the other thing that I thought was, in a group of white women, to understand their privilege, understanding that privilege in the context of what? Because when you have a group of white women, the overarching privilege that often gets talked about, which is the thing that activates the political divisiveness, is racial privilege. Right. And so, but we also try to reinforce that there are different types of privilege.
Right.
I don't want to dismiss one over the other. I also don't want to make them equal, because the implications of them are vastly different. And some of these have a heavier weight than others.
Right.
So maybe I was just sharing thinking out there, but does that make sense?
Yeah. And right, I use that analogy because it's one that's been used for a long time. But it's about, right, like my ability to drive representation in my organization, because we're not going to change the world until we see true representation. And so right now, I mean, it is unequal and unweighted.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Well, you talked about, let me see here. We talked about this, but I mean, I love these slides. I'm going to put this up here. Intentions may be good. And folks, this is not a sales pitch, but can you talk, so that it's not a sales pitch, can you just talk maybe about the why behind the app? Like,
Yeah.
why is it not okay to have good intentions? Because a lot of people say, well, but that wasn't my intentions. Well, I had good, my intentions were good. So where is this going? Like, how can I interrupt that? And how can I be intentional,
Yes.
not accidentally unintentional?
Yeah. Well, we know amazing and emotional intelligence is driving from awareness to action. And
Yeah.
so, right, it's our job to educate ourselves and to know what good looks like, and to know what being an amazing leader and being an amazing human being and an inclusive human being looks like. And so, yes, those things happen. Yes, I've been an NBC, or I've had a nice but clueless moment. It's having the ability to say, I made a mistake. I'm going to learn from that, not do it again, and make sure that I help educate other people around me to also not make those mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's literally what we're doing in the app, is bringing people into this safe space to learn and grow and develop, because the reality is this stuff has never been taught. And so many of us are learning from the very beginning, right? I've been in a space for 15 years. So I'm saying, like, we, the collective professionals, are learning terminology, how to, how not to, what to say, what not to say, how to act for the very first time.
Well, that's because business, for the longest time, leave your emotions at the door.
Right.
We're here to do work. We're not here to make friends.
Right.
And for many, that's still true. Throw out the generational idea that, well, millennials don't feel that way. We're all unique, and some people do feel like I'm not here to make friends. I felt that way, by the way, when I was at work, because I was a local and I had a lot of friends in the city where I lived and I worked, and many of my colleagues didn't, and so they had started to create these groups of friendships, and I appreciated that. But I didn't need to go to happy hour because I wanted to go to happy hour with my friends.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that today it's okay to share feelings, to talk in a way in the workplace that we never talked
That's
like
right.
this before.
Yeah.
And that means we have to fumble through the language a little bit. And, you know, you said it, get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a practice. This isn't just a D&I conversation. And that's the thing that I try to bring home with my clients. Being more intentional, being more self-aware, learning how to navigate uncomfortable moments, discussing sensitive topics. Those are generic. There are things all of us need to do all of the time. And when we do that, all of us feel better in the group setting. If you've ever had to tell somebody that their performance isn't so great, that's a difficult conversation, right? There are lots of different examples. Take D&I out of it completely. We're talking about skills and competencies that people need, and we can practice them in little moments because they're not things that are going to come naturally, right? I don't think in our society, I think generally we're taught to be polite. We're raised to be polite. We're raised to be respectful. And that's why we don't know how to speak up in some ways about certain things, because it feels rude. It feels disrespectful. It feels mean. And we don't want to be that way.
Well, the reality is, when I started my career 23 years ago, we didn't bring our whole selves to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
You brought the part of you to work that they told you to bring to work.
Right.
Right. All right. Well, we have a few minutes, probably like 2 or 3 minutes. There are a couple things in here. Somebody was asking about how do you balance D&I in the sense that perhaps it's swinging to the point of discriminating against white men. And I know that there's a real thought out there. So how do you balance creating a more diverse workforce with and being thoughtful about diversity without no longer hiring white guys? Because that's not the solution here. That is not what we're advocating.
No, and really it's about, right, it's first and foremost about making sure we've got the best person for the job, right? It is not about checking a box and making sure that we've brought on this person or that person. But the reality is, because of a lot of the privilege that has existed for decades, the scale has been tilted. So it is time for us to look at folks more equally. This is where the equity conversation really comes into play. And so how do we make sure that we're giving a fair shot to those that have not been given a fair shot traditionally? Right? We're talking about historic things that go hundreds of years in our country. And so
it's going to take a while to interrupt that.
It is. So I'm not sure if I answered that question.
Yeah, it's a tough one to answer because that's something that comes up over and over and over and over again. And it's just really about being, I'm repeating us now, being intentional and being aware, because that is not a solution in any way, shape, or form. All right, before we wrap up, a couple of things I want to share. First of all, I mentioned at the top, this is a bi-weekly webinar series. So 2 weeks from now, Leah Smiley is going to be joining me. We're going to be talking about ESG and environmental social governance and how it relates to D&I. But more importantly, that there are very big differences about why it's important to the different generations. So I will invite you all to join us. Registration, I think, just opened yesterday. In a month from now, I'm doing this webinar about neurodiversity. So I would encourage you all to join it. You have the handout, and it has the QR code, and it's certainly available to register now. As we open the last poll, Jess, you have some real calls to action here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about more of these?
I do. If there are, a couple things that you can do as a leader as you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it shouldn't be something separate that you're doing. It should be something that we're weaving into all of our processes, whether it's recruiting, retaining, growing, promoting. We have to challenge ourselves and look at what our own unconscious bias is. And so it's time for us to all level set and really look at our teams, look at the organizations that we work for. How are we doing? Are we really starting to challenge the norms that we've seen in the past? I challenge you to find your own voice, to speak up. If you see something being done in an improper way, bring it up, talk, right? Get a group of individuals that all feel similarly and are passionate about representation, and talk to teams. Absolutely. Ask the hard questions, right? These are 4 really simple takeaways. Challenge yourself, never judge a book by its cover, right? Yes, I am a privileged white woman who is here fighting and doing the work because of my children, because I don't want them to go through the challenges that biracial children have gone through in the past. Yeah. Create a safe place for your employees, right? I hope you all enjoyed the conversation today. I hope you learned at least one little takeaway that you can take back to your organizations. And Janae, thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. This is a conversation that kept going and going and going. Our contact information is here. So on the bio slide for Jess, you see her contact information. Mine is there, company information here. And you are welcome to reach out to either one of us on LinkedIn if there's any conversation that you want to continue having with us. So thank you, Jess, for joining me.
Thanks,